The air in Willow Apartments was always heavy, like an unspoken weight pressed against your chest. Sarah had only been living there for 2 days when she met Rachel, a timid young woman from the second floor. Rachel had the look of someone constantly on edge, her eyes darted toward every shadow, and she clutched her sweater as if it could shield her from unseen dangers. Sarah had cornered her near the mailboxes. "Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm new here. I was wondering if you've heard about the knocking, at night." Rachel froze, her face draining of color. She glanced toward the hallway as if afraid someone, or something, was listening. "You've already heard it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Last night, around 3. Just a soft knock. I didn't open the door." Rachel gripped Sarah's arm, her nails digging into her skin. Her voice trembled as she said, "Don't stay. It doesn't stop. It only gets louder. And once you open the door." Rachel trailed off, her gaze fixed on something far behind Sarah, something that wasn't there. "What happens?" Sarah pressed, but Rachel shook her head violently, pulling away. "Just leave. While you still can." She hurried up the stairs, leaving Sarah alone in the dim hallway, her words lingering like a shadow. That night, Sarah sat at her desk, her laptop screen glowing softly in the darkness. She replayed the recording from the previous night, the faint, rhythmic knocking at exactly 3 a.m. She had expected some sort of explanation, but all it did was send chills down her spine. Determined to find answers, Sarah started digging into the building's past. It wasn't easy. Willow Apartments had changed hands so many times that its history was fragmented. Most records were incomplete, and those she could find offered little more than vague mentions of incidents and disturbances. But then, in the dusty archives of a local library, she stumbled across a grainy newspaper article from 1928. The article detailed a series of events at a boarding house that once stood where Willow Apartments now stood. It had been run by Margaret Hale, a stern, middle-aged woman with a reputation for cruelty. Tenants whispered of her sadistic punishments for those who couldn't pay their rent, starving them, locking them in the basement, or worse. Margaret's reign of terror came to a brutal end when one of her tenants, a young man named Richard Lorne, snapped. According to witnesses, he had confronted Margaret in the dining hall, screaming about the things in the basement. The argument turned violent, and Richard stabbed Margaret repeatedly with a kitchen knife. The article ended with a chilling note: Margaret Hale's body was never recovered. Witnesses claim Richard dragged her into the basement, but searches yielded no remains. The building was demolished shortly after, but whispers of hauntings began almost immediately. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. The story explained some of the strange occurrences in the building, but it raised more questions than answers. What had Richard meant by things in the basement? And why did the disappearances start decades later, long after Margaret's death? Sarah decided to dig deeper. The next morning, she cornered Mr. Grayson, the landlord, in the lobby. The man was a relic of the building itself, stooped, gray-haired, and with a face that seemed etched with secrets. "Mr. Grayson," she began, "I need to know about Margaret Hale. About what happened here." The old man stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be poking around in things you don't understand," he muttered. "People have disappeared," Sarah pressed. "Someone has to figure out why." Grayson hesitated before sighing deeply. "If you're so determined, I'll show you. But don't say I didn't warn you." He led her to the basement, his keys jangling as he unlocked the heavy metal door. The air inside was damp and suffocating, the faint smell of decay clinging to the walls. In the far corner of the basement, Grayson stopped in front of a large, bricked-up section of the wall. "This is where it happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret's body is back there. I'm sure of it." Sarah's stomach churned. "Why hasn't anyone opened it?" Grayson shook his head. "We tried once, years ago. But after that, things got worse. The knocking started. Tenants disappeared. The building seems to punish anyone who tries to disturb her." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stared at the door of her apartment, waiting for the knocking to begin. When it did, right on cue at 3 a.m., it was louder than before. The knocks reverberated through the room, each one sending a jolt of fear through her. She grabbed her camera and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" she whispered. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low and guttural, replied. "Let me in." Sarah stumbled backward, her blood running cold. She didn't open the door, but the voice continued, repeating the same chilling phrase over and over. "Let me in. Let me in." Over the next few days, Sarah pieced together more of the building's history. Through old police records, she learned that Richard Lorne hadn't acted alone. Several tenants had helped him confront Margaret, claiming she had been performing strange rituals in the basement. They believed she was summoning something, an entity that thrived on fear and despair. When Margaret died, the tenants thought it was over. But the entity didn't leave. It stayed, tethered to the building, using Margaret as its vessel. The knocking, Sarah realized, was the entity's way of feeding. It preyed on curiosity, luring victims to open the door. Once they did, they were taken, consumed by the darkness that Margaret had unleashed. Sarah knew she had to confront the source. Armed with a crowbar, she returned to the basement and began chipping away at the bricked-up wall. It was slow, grueling work, but she pressed on, driven by a mix of terror and determination. When the final brick fell away, Sarah found herself staring into a small, dark chamber. Inside, skeletal remains were chained to the walls, Margaret's victims. And in the center of the room was a shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing as if made of smoke. Before Sarah could react, the figure surged toward her, filling her mind with images of Margaret's cruelty, the suffering of her victims, and the countless souls claimed by the entity. Sarah screamed, her voice echoing in the darkness. Sarah's scream echoed through the small chamber as the shadowy figure lunged toward her. Its form twisted and expanded, filling the room with a suffocating darkness. The air grew icy, and Sarah felt a searing pain in her chest, as if the entity was trying to claw its way inside her. "No," she gasped, stumbling backward. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she swung the crowbar wildly. It passed through the figure as though it were made of mist, but the action bought her a fraction of a second. She turned and bolted, scrambling up the basement stairs as the entity's enraged growl echoed behind her. The stairs seemed endless, each step heavier than the last. The shadows stretched unnaturally, reaching for her like living things. The temperature dropped further, and Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs as she raced for the basement door. Just as she reached the top, the door slammed shut in her face. She yanked at the handle, her hands trembling, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the growling intensified, accompanied by the sound of something slithering up the stairs. "Open," she screamed, pounding on the door. She could feel the darkness creeping closer, the icy tendrils brushing against her neck. Then, with a groan, the door flew open, and Sarah stumbled into the hallway. She slammed it shut behind her, her heart pounding in her ears. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. Back in her apartment, Sarah tried to catch her breath, but the building seemed alive with menace. The walls creaked and groaned, and faint whispers echoed through the vents. She checked her cameras, hoping to find some explanation for what she'd just experienced, but all the footage was corrupted, static and distorted images of her own terrified face staring back at her. The knocking started again that night, louder and more insistent than ever. It rattled the doorframe, shaking the walls. Sarah sat frozen in the corner of the room, her phone clutched in her hand. She wanted to call for help, but who would believe her? Then came the voice, low and guttural, like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "Sarah! Let me in." She clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. But the voice was inside her head now, whispering her name over and over. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, but before she could find it, something cold brushed against her arm. She screamed and backed away, her hand finding the crowbar she'd left on the floor. She swung wildly, hitting nothing but air. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Sarah! Let me in. Let me in. Unable to take it anymore, Sarah grabbed her bag and bolted out of the apartment. The hallway was even darker than her room, the flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. She could hear footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. She turned a corner and ran straight into Rachel. The young woman's face was pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with terror. "You shouldn't have gone to the basement," Rachel whispered. "You've made it angry. I need to get out of here." Sarah cried. "How do we stop this?" Rachel shook her head. "You don't stop it. You run. But even then, it might follow." The words sent a chill through Sarah. She grabbed Rachel's arm. "Come with me. We can leave together." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Together, they raced down the stairs, the oppressive darkness seeming to press in from all sides. When they reached the lobby, they found Mr. Grayson waiting for them. His face was ashen, his hands trembling. "You've unleashed it," he said, his voice shaking. "I warned you not to disturb the basement." Before Sarah could respond, the shadows in the room began to shift. The growling returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The air grew cold, and a dark mist seeped through the cracks in the walls, coalescing into the shape of Margaret Hale. Her face was a grotesque mask of fury, her hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. "You think you can leave?" she hissed, her voice like the screech of rusted metal. Rachel screamed and clung to Sarah as Margaret lunged toward them. Mr. Grayson stepped forward, holding up a crucifix. "Back to the darkness, Margaret," he shouted. The ghost recoiled, but the shadows around her grew larger, forming claw-like appendages that lashed out at the landlord. He cried out as they struck him, sending him crashing to the floor. "Run," he gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. Sarah and Rachel bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The entire building seemed to groan in protest, its walls warping and twisting as if alive. The mist surged toward them, and Sarah swung the crowbar desperately, buying them a few seconds to retreat. "We're trapped," Rachel cried, tears streaming down her face. "No," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "There has to be a way." She remembered the fire escape outside her bedroom window. Grabbing Rachel's hand, she led her back upstairs, the entity's furious screams echoing behind them. They climbed out onto the fire escape, the icy night air biting at their skin. The city below seemed impossibly far away, as if the building itself existed in another realm. But the entity wasn't finished with them. The mist seeped through the cracks in the walls, materializing on the rooftop in front of them. Margaret's figure emerged once more, her skeletal hand reaching for Sarah. "You brought this on yourself," she snarled. "Now you'll join the others." Sarah raised the crowbar, her hands shaking. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, though her voice betrayed her fear. Margaret laughed, a bone-chilling sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Lies," she said. "I can taste your fear." Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah swung the crowbar at a nearby electrical box. Sparks flew, and the entity shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Run!" Sarah yelled to Rachel. They scrambled down the fire escape, the entity's screams fading as they reached the ground. For a moment, the two women stood in stunned silence, staring up at the darkened building. "Is it over?" Rachel whispered. Sarah shook her head. "I don't think it ever will be." Sarah and Rachel fled the city that night, but the events at Willow Apartments haunted them. Sarah vowed to tell the world what she had experienced, but every time she tried to write about it, her words would disappear from the screen, as if erased by an unseen hand. And late at night, when the world was quiet, she still heard it, the faint, rhythmic knocking at her door. It remains a mystery. Have you ever faced something horror in your entire life? If yes, then write it in the comments section. And if you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe, it's motivate me to find new horror stories worldwide and upload them for you. Thank you for listening till to the end.